All central banks routinely do this. Okay? And the second one is that the notes issued by central banks, which is their liability, is always guaranteed by the government of the day. And that means that the treasury is actually standing behind the central bank. Okay? And that means that if a central bank, if it so happens, okay, reaches a situation where its financial net worth, okay, is negative, okay, it can be recapitalized by the finance ministry of the day. Okay? And that is not something with limited liability. There is unlimited liability. Okay? The finance ministry can and will have to finance a central bank which runs up into a negative net worth problem. Okay? Of course, there is the flip side of this, okay, which is something which is being argued in India today. Okay? But I'm not going to be commenting too much on the Indian thing except saying a few things later. But what I would like to say is that this is also well known to historians of economic policy and macroeconomists. Okay? A very famous example that I'll spend a minute dwelling on was the fight that happened in 1997 between the ministry. At that time, Chancellor Helmut Kohl was heading Germany, and 1997 was a very peculiar year for Germany because the unemployment rates had reached the highest ever since the Great Depression in Germany. And so there was a lot of call to actually do welfare payments. On the other hand, the reunification that was taking place with East Germany also required a lot of expenditures. Okay? But Germany had entered into the famous Maastricht Treaty, which basically said that there is a limit on the amount of deficits that you can actually hold. And the deficit started to creep up for these two, because of these two events, the great rise in unemployment and the reunification. So Helmut Kohl started to eye the resources in the central bank, the Bundesbank. Okay? And when he looked at the Bundesbank, just like the government of India today is looking at the RBI, the argument that he gave them was that the valuation that you are doing of assets, which was forex assets and gold, is done on a least cost principle. So the assets are valued at the time at which they are bought, okay? And so that becomes the book value of the asset. But if the value changes, they don't change the value of the asset. Okay? And so the value of gold at that time was something like 55 billion Deutschmark in the market. But on the books of the Bundesbank, it was something like 13.5 billion Deutschmark. Okay? And so he said that you should actually be revaluing it, to market value principles. And then all that valuation that you get, you should just transfer it to the finance ministry, and the finance ministry then has money to basically plug the deficit, and everyone leads a very nice life. Okay? What he didn't reckon for was that in the bank, even though the governor of the bank supported him, Hans Stettmeyer, he didn't reckon that of the governors of the bank, 6 of them owed their allegiance to another party, and of course the chief economist of the central bank, a person I hold in high regard, Ottmar Ising, was a monetary hawk. Okay? And he actually pushed not to actually allow that to happen. So eventually, there was a big fight for many months, just like is going on in India, but it ended up with the resource transfer not taking place. Okay? So this is common. It's not something that happens only in one country. It is historically known. It happens across the world. And it's surprising that two arms of government are not able to actually coordinate and talk about it and sort of resolve it in a way which is non-conflictual. Okay? So as I said, I'm really going to be talking about these two arms of the state and how they are interrelated. Okay? And with one being the short end arm of the stake and the other the long-term deep pockets arm. Okay? Let me not spend time on this. Okay? The reason central banks are looking more and more like fiscal authorities is also because they now started to pay interest on reserves. Okay? And this is very much, something which is making them look much more like a fiscal authority. And sovereign debt troubles, which have been happening in all parts of the world, specifically in the euro area, okay, are reminding every country that there is a fiscal limit, okay, beyond which debt is not assured. Okay. And that means that fiscal expectations can actually also be drivers of inflation and not just monetary policy per se. Okay. Finally, aging populations in large parts of the world, okay, have also created fiscal stress. Okay. And this, any projected debt figures that you see, whether you see them from government organizations or by private academics, okay, you find that this is a ballooning problem. Okay, that debts are going to be growing even in advanced parts of the world. Okay. At one time, when you talked of debts and deficits, you talked of Latin America or you talked of Asia, South Asia. Okay. Today, the problem is the reverse. Okay. Many of the high debt deficit countries are actually advanced economies. Okay. So let me go about my business by presenting first the central bank balance sheet. Okay. And I'm basically taking a very simple balance sheet. I'm not looking at its operating costs. I'm assuming those are zero, etc., just for simplicity. And so it has two assets, as we well know. It basically holds government securities and it has forex reserves. And on the liability side, there is the monetary base. Okay. Now, that means, if you look at the financial net worth of a central bank, okay, it can very well be negative. Okay. That's nothing to be surprised about. Okay. It's quite possible. All it requires is that if there is negative net worth, that you are actually going to raise seigniorage in future by issuing more nominal currency in the future or in the present, okay, provided you still are trying to keep inflation under control. Okay. If you look at the government's financial balance sheet, okay, then we will find all governments' financial balance sheet net worth of most governments is always negative, okay, by design. Okay. They basically issue debt. Okay. And the debt is either held by the central bank or it is held outside the central bank. Okay. And so the financial net worth is going to be negative. Okay. But if you consolidate it, okay, which is what I've done, I've just taken the two balance sheets together and consolidated it in the one below, then you find that whatever is the debt that the central government has issued, okay, gets cancelled out by the holding of that debt by the central bank. Okay. And so at the end of the day, the financial balance sheet of the state is nothing else but the foreign exchange reserves, which are the assets. So those are the assets that are being held. And the liabilities are the monetary base and those government securities held outside the central bank. Okay. And that is really what we should be focusing on as policy makers. We should be focusing on this. This is the budget constraint that matters for the economy. Okay, not the separate balance sheets of the two entities. Okay. And that means that there is a requirement for coordination. There is a requirement for them to talk to each other. Okay. We're not saying that they should listen to, they should necessarily follow, one should follow what the other says. But unless you coordinate, unless you talk about macroeconomic policy and what you're trying to achieve, and you have similar goals, your goals are output inflation. The central bank may be bothered about financial stability in addition, and the finance ministry may be bothered about redistribution in addition. But apart from that, they do have common goals. And to achieve those common goals, there is a requirement that there should be coordination across these two entities. Okay. It cannot be that one treats the other in isolation and works accordingly. And that, I believe, is the source of large parts of problems that occur in India as well as in other countries. Okay. So I won't take you through the technical details. Okay. If you actually look at the budget of the government, so it's just government expenditures minus whatever tax payments it gets and operational transfers. Let me not take you through this. It's just a way of actually, it'll just put you off. It's meant for a more technical audience. Okay, it's something that I would be presenting, later to a more technical audience as well as to some people at the RBI. But so the issue really is, as I said, that the financial deficit that matters is the financial deficit of the government and the central bank. Okay, And somehow we don't focus on that as we should be. Okay? And what it means is that if for some reason the debt issued by the central bank, okay, is sort of, the value of that debt which has been issued is less than, is greater than the present value of surpluses that are going to happen in the future, then there is a hole in the budget, right? And the intertemporal hole in the budget can only then be actually plugged if there is going to be some rise in taxation in future, or there is going to be some increase in real money, real base money or seigniorage. Okay? Without that, you'll either have inflation or you're going to have defaults. Okay? So both are clear implications of the constraint. This is not something which is unknown. Okay? I mean, here's a quote from many years ago, okay, from a person who is a well-known macroeconomist. Okay? The central bank is always an agent of the state. It is not an agent of government, right? But it is an agent of the state. And that means certain very clear principles. I believe a large part of the problems that occur is just not clear accounting that is taking place when we look at the central bank and its transfers. Okay? So if you think of the operational surplus of the RBI or any central bank, which is going to be transferred to the government, okay? This is money that the RBI gets through financial transactions, through income on its financial assets. This is not money received because of some production activity or because of some income distribution. And to the extent that it is income from a financial asset, okay, when you transfer it, it can be used to finance a deficit, but it cannot be used to reduce a deficit. Okay, so it's a very important point which is being missed in the debates that are taking place in India today. Okay? This is really, a problem of bad accounting. Okay? If we know this, I mean, public finance people have been speaking about this in India for a long while, about how in the deficit figures should disinvestments be part of the definition of the deficit. In a similar way, any operational surplus transferred by the RBI cannot be treated as something which is, reducing a deficit. It's not a revenue item for the state. It is actually an income from an asset, and therefore it can be used to finance a deficit, but not to reduce a deficit. I think it's a very important accounting principle that we do not follow. Since we do not follow, it creates problems even for the central bank, because if you do not follow it, the central bank can be incentivized by the finance ministry to think more about operating in such a way that transfers to the ministry increase rather than focusing on its goal of affecting inflation and output. Okay? Think of, for example, if the central bank were to sell gold or forex assets and get some money out of it and then transfer that to the government. Okay? Again, I believe this is not something that can be used to finance the deficit. Okay? This is, to my mind, nothing other than an increase in the equity of the government in the central bank. Okay? It cannot be treated as when you sell, because it's a national asset. Yes, the central bank is the bank which actually operates the national asset. But given that it's a national asset, a sale of a national asset can only be offset by a rise in the equity of the government in the RBI. It cannot be treated, it's being used to finance a deficit. Okay? And finally, I must make a comment, tongue-in-cheek, about demonetization. Okay? Because if you decide as a government, okay, that you and Reserve Bank, if you decide that you are going to withdraw currency in circulation, you are getting rid of a liability. Okay? And the moment you get rid of the liability on the balance sheet, according to me, you automatically should be saying that the equity account of the government is credited. You can't treat that as a transfer that you are going to use to finance a deficit. Okay? So I think we've not got our accounting correct. Okay? And if we do our accounting appropriately, like good economists, like good public accountants, we would not have got ourselves into the mess that we have. Okay? And this is happens across countries. I believe there is a political economy even to accounting. Okay? And there are good reasons why we want to do things in a certain way, because we want to actually have this flexibility to play with resources rather than very clearly assigned resources where they should be named and assigned. Okay. Okay. Just to remind ourselves of this coordination problem between central banks and finance ministry, I'd like you to take a look at this graph, which is basically showing us the major assets of the RBI. The red is the domestic assets, and the blue is its forex assets. Okay, and if you look at it, you will see that there was a year 2004 where suddenly there is no red. Okay, and at that time, the RBI had only forex assets. Okay? And that was a very tough time for the RBI. Okay? That was a time when capital flows were coming into the country in a large way. The RBI intervened to stop the appreciation of the currency, and so started to pick up forex reserves. When it got the forex reserves, it started to realize that money supply was growing out of hand, its inflation target was being hit. And so it started to sterilize. So it started to sell bonds. And one morning it woke up to find that it had no G-Secs on its balance sheet. Okay? At that time, what do you do? Okay, that's where the state bails you in. And the state did. The state actually started market stabilization bonds. Those of you all who remember that period, the very recent period of our history. And the market stabilization bonds sucked money out of the economy, and the money was parked in the RBI, and the state paid interest on behalf of the RBI. Okay? And that's coordination. Okay? And that's how we managed to get out of that period. So there have been periods where the state bails out the RBI. There have been periods, on the other hand, where the RBI might help the state. Okay? But there has to be coordination. There has to be talk. Okay? A lot of, in monetary theory, we talk about it's not just about open market operations that the RBI is involved in. It's also about open mouth operations, okay? And it's important that you actually have this dialogue. Otherwise, it's very, very difficult to ensure that you are going to get outcomes which are good for the country. Okay, let me skip this. Okay. Now, let me just spend the next how much time do I have? I don't want to run out of. Okay, no one's answering me. Great. Open budget constraint. Okay. So, in the next part of the presentation, I just want to build on this theme slightly. Okay. And what I'm really saying here is that when the government issues debt, okay, we don't normally ask ourselves the question about, how do you actually value this debt, okay? And if you ask yourself that question about how you value the debt, then you'll think of it as debt is issued just like any financial instrument. And any financial instrument's price should just be the present value of expected returns from that financial instrument, okay? And if that is the case, then what is the return? What is the price of debt? The price of debt is the present value of future surpluses from the budget, because how will the debt be repaid? It can only be repaid if there's going to be a surplus in future. Okay? And that means it leads to a very interesting insight. The insight is that if you think about it, okay, I'm not going to take you through the model again. I'm sorry that all this is creeping in. I didn't have the time to actually redo the slides. Okay? But what I'm really saying is that think of, I must be having a statement here. Yeah, the value of an asset is basically the expected present value of future cash flows. In which case, for bonds, the value of the bonds, real value, is the expected present value of primary surpluses in future. Okay? Now think of if the bonds are issued, and if the expectation is that there's going to be no surpluses in future, okay? Then what happens? The only way that equation, the bonds have already been issued, the nominal value of bonds is known today. The only way that equation can be satisfied is for prices to rise. Okay? And that means that when the government is spending in a particular way, it is also affecting inflation. And so inflation is not just a monetary phenomenon, okay? Inflation, I mean, this is again well known to macroeconomists. Sargent and, reminds us often and saying that, yeah, inflation may be a monetary phenomenon, but issue of base money is always a fiscal phenomenon, okay? And basically what you're saying is that fiscal policy is also impacting on inflation and not just monetary policy, okay? And if that is the case, then if you are going to give the central bank the target for inflation, okay, then it can only manage that target provided fiscal authorities are actually appropriately managing the fisc, okay? If the fisc is going to go out of hand and future deficits are going to continuously grow, you're actually going to create expectations of inflation from the fiscal side, when on the monetary side, you're trying to hold in those inflationary expectations, okay? And that can be serious for a central bank, okay? So therefore, the assumption that is required for monetary policy to work is that if there is going to be government debt in a period, the expectation is that the government is going to, at some point, be able to pay that back. And if that expectation does not fructify, okay, then you're basically you're not anchoring fiscal expectations and you're not anchoring inflation, and that can be problematic, okay? So for an inflation targeting regime to work, which is what India works with, you need to anchor fiscal expectations as well, okay? And when central banks are given a mandate to control inflation, it requires the fiscal authority a mandate to ensure that deficits lead to surpluses, okay? And therefore, all that I'm saying here is fiscal rules matter. Without fiscal rules, you're going to have a problem of managing even inflation, okay? And you could do fiscal rules. Govind is an authority on this. You can do fiscal rules in many ways. You can have independent fiscal councils. Many countries have dealt with it in many different ways. Most of them don't have a bite, okay? But that's another issue altogether, okay? So that's the second part of what I wanted to say, okay? And finally, what it means is that when you're looking at, debt management, okay, typically the government of India and most people basically say the function of debt management, okay, is to minimize the costs of meeting government's needs, taking into account the acceptable level of risk. I always say add, and also that debt management is consistent with the aims of monetary policy, okay? Because if it is not, then you're leading to fiscal expectations of inflation, and that can actually undermine debt management as well as monetary policy. Okay. I believe that because there has been no coordination between the central bank and the fiscal authority, both are playing a game of chicken, okay? And that can actually lead to disaster for the economy, okay? That's really the essence of what's been going on in India in the most recent past. Game of chicken is well known to those of you all who are not not gone through an economics program. It basically says that, this is a game that used to be played by teenagers. So they are basically, going head on against each other down a narrow road in their cars, and they meet at a junction, and then they have to decide whether they swerve or they actually turn, okay? Now, if you go straight, okay, you have not chickened out, you had the nerve, and the other guy swerves, then you actually, are the guy who wins. You held your nerve, the other guy didn't. If you swerve because you lost your nerve at the last minute, and the other guy basically, goes straight, then, he wins and you lose. If both go straight, then you crash, okay? This is a well-known game. And the solution to this game, okay, if people are looking for solutions, is basically to say, okay, that there are two solutions, okay? If I look at a very restricted set of solutions, okay? And this is basically what, because anyone coming up on that motor path is basically saying, I should hang on and I should not swerve because the other guy will not want an accident, and so he should swerve, and the other guy is thinking similarly, and so at the end it's just a loss of nerve which makes one swerve. So anything could be an outcome. Either you swerve or the other guy swerves, okay? Similar thing is happening between the fiscal and monetary authority, okay? Should you tax finance or debt finance, or should you accommodate or not accommodate? And both are basically playing a game of chicken, okay? And I believe that is bad news for the economy, okay? So let me sort of, there are many instances of this, okay, where, finance ministers have actually said very clearly that, in fact, this happened when I was part of the Technical Advisory Committee on Monetary Policy, and I remember we were debating whether to go for an interest rate hike or not. And 2 days before, the finance minister called a press conference and announced that I'm confident RBI will reduce rates. And we said, what the hell, what's our job here? I mean, he's already announced it, So he was playing chicken with us, okay? So as you can well imagine, we also played chicken. We didn't swerve, we went straight, okay? And that annoyed him, okay? So that is what was good. Unnecessary. If there was a coordination, it could have been done much better, okay? It's happened many a time. We know this very well in India, okay? Chidambaram also did it with the RBI at that time, okay? And these are well-known quotes, okay? So I need not talk about them. He basically talked about how, if he has to walk alone, he'll walk alone, okay? Bad news. Both should be walking together. Both should be headed in the same direction, okay? I believe, therefore, and let me end with this, let me not, harp the point too much, that both monetary and fiscal policy, okay, is well known, are actually two ends of macroeconomic management, okay? In intertemporal macro and in intertemporal public finance, okay, they're actually the liquid end and the long end. And therefore, they require coordination, okay? I argued that, if you do not do the coordination, there could be bad outcomes for the economy. You could have inflation coming out because of fiscal expectations and not just monetary expectations. And then it's very difficult to manage an economy, okay? I'm not saying a central bank should not be independent. Please be careful about interpreting what I'm saying, okay? But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't have that conversation if the finance minister calls you on the line, okay? The governor should very much have that conversation, okay? Finally, what I'm saying also is that somehow we don't focus as public finance people enough on the accounting principles. I believe if the accounting principles are done right, none of these debates would actually happen, okay? And that we would actually be living in a very different, much better world.
Thank you, Professor D'Souza, for the wonderful lecture. We are happy to have with us Professor Sukhpal Singh, IIMA, with us. May I request Sugandh to please welcome Professor Singh with the bouquet. Please welcome, sir. It's now my pleasure to invite Professor Sukhpal Singh to deliver the lecture. He'll be deliberating on the topic of reforming agricultural
reforming agri markets. This one, Patna, no, let's go to PowerPoint. I think it's better. It is showing like this. This one? No. This one, organic farming? No. You get into this one, yeah. You said date modified. Already got it.
We can load it from there.
That will be just it, not copy. No, this is not the one. Open नहीं होना चाहिए. नहीं. वो समय नहीं रहता यहाँ पे. Okay. Honorable Deputy Chief Minister of Bihar, my colleague Professor D'Souza, Dr. Govind Rao, who doesn't seem to be around, Dr. Mukherjee, Dr. Shaibal Gupta, other friends and co-panelists on the dais, friends and colleagues in the audience, and ladies and gentlemen. Let me say that I'm very happy to be here at the ADRI organized event for the first time. I have been asked to speak on this burning issue of reforming agriculture markets in India. What I plan to do, because I was asked to give a talk on agriculture, but I chose to focus on this. So I plan to, within the given time frame I have, 30 to 35 minutes, to first highlight some of the major issues in the farm sector, which are being perceived as agrarian crisis or agrarian distress, and then some of the challenges which Indian agriculture faces at this juncture, and including the marketing challenges, and what is being planned at the policy level, both in terms of regulation as well as promotion or development of agricultural markets. I'm referring particularly to two new model acts, APLM, Agriculture Produce and Livestock Markets Act 2017, and Contract Farming and Services Act 2018. I'm also happy to be here because Bihar was one of the states in the last decade which took a call not to amend the act, but abolish the act altogether in 2006. And I was one of the participants in the meeting in Delhi where this was announced. So it's a very appropriate kind of place to talk about marketing reforms in the agriculture sector. Now, if I move on and share with you the fact that if we are talking about the agriculture sector today in India, there are all kinds of perceptions and perspectives on this. The first point I would like to highlight is that I feel, and I can prove that with evidence, that size of the farm is not an issue so far as viability of agriculture is concerned in this country or anywhere in the world. I've just done a paper as a memorial lecture delivered last month where I have given evidence from across the globe that corporate farming is not working. Wherever it emerged, it's declining. And small farms, including in India, have been found to be the most efficient in terms of producing the highest value of output per unit area. And I say this very often that it is not the size of the farm, but what you do on that farm, how you do, when you do, how much you do, for whom you do, and why you do. That's what makes it viable or unviable. We have carried out studies of what we call small farms but prosperous farmers, where we have farmers in India who operate, not necessarily own, but operate less than 5 acres of land and make anywhere between 100,000 rupees to 700,000 rupees per acre per year net profit. So I personally believe that there's a money in agriculture and agribusiness. It's a different matter that the farmer is not able to make it. So we will not dwell on this issue further, that farm size is not a problem. The issue is that even if a farmer who has 5 acres in this country, in the given cropping pattern and other conditions of doing farming he or she may not be able to get a good livelihood for a family of 5. That is because the kind of cropping pattern which is there, if 60% of India grows just wheat and paddy on its gross cropped area, then you can only earn so much. Therefore, there is an issue of alternative sources of income, because already about 30 to 50% of smallholders' incomes come from dairying, and another 25% of the gross value added in the agriculture sector comes from horticulture sector. So horticulture and dairying together account for something like 45 to 50% total GDP of agriculture in this country. And even at the farmer level, farming is only about 50% of the total income a farmer earns from various sources. Therefore, farming is not the mainstay of farmers for themselves even. So there also it is, we should look beyond and look differently at agriculture. We all know the serious problems of inputs markets and output markets. I don't want to go into details of that except fertilizer subsidies, no state subsidy reaches the small and marginal farmers adequately. And I did this exercise of analyzing all the central and state government policies to look at what is there in these policies for marginal and small farmers, which is specially targeted at them. Other than the priority sector credit and the micro irrigation guidelines, one could not find much. We keep talking of small and marginal farmers, we keep talking in their name, but mostly policy design do not really adequately provide for their special interests. The issues of farmers can be addressed both in terms of production risk and market risk. And the problem here is that on both fronts, the policies are not able to do enough. If you look at crop insurance, it is not able to move beyond 1/3 of the cropped area. There are serious issues in terms of implementation and so on. Of course, the new policy is much better than what we had in the past in terms of risk coverage. On the market side, there are missing markets which don't offer remunerated prices. MSP system doesn't go beyond a few percentage of the farmers and a few states and a few crops. I call them 2.5 states and 3.5 crops. Yeah. So the issue is that we are not able to help the small farmers deal with markets both in terms of buying as well as selling. And one of the ways to do that was to have farmer collectives. Unfortunately, they are also missing most of the time. Only about 2% of the farmers are member of any farmer association and about 5% of any self-help group. And most of the self-help groups are not into farming, actually they are into other allied activities. And some of the so-called progressive states like Punjab, the picture is even decimal, 0.3 and 1.5%. So if we want farmers to fight or deal with modern markets, whether it's exporters, processors, supermarkets, multinationals or whatever, or even large statal bodies, then we need to have platforms where farmers can deal with these bigger buyers who tend to generally look for larger volumes which only larger farmers can provide. The serious issue also is of the interlocking of markets. A lot of the indebtedness, a lot of the so-called farmer suicides are also because of the fact that even today, institutional credit accounts for only 60% total credit needs of the farm sector. 40% still comes from, at the national level, comes from non-institutional sources. And interlocking refers to when you have the lender who gives money or gives inputs on credit, then ask the farmer to supply back the harvest to him, from which the payments are deducted. So there is a serious interlocking of credit and output market, input and output market, and sometimes in the case of tenants and lenders, even credit and labor markets. And if you'll be shocked if I share this case with you, that there is this state called Punjab, which we all talk in terms of agriculture development and prosperity and modernization and so on. There is an issue of direct payments to farmers, which is hanging fire for the last 20 years. When FCI or CCI or any government agency buys from farmers, the payment is not made to the farmer, even today when I'm speaking. It goes to somebody else in that somebody else's name, even though the farmer has sold her produce or his produce. That is called Artiya. And that is because of interlocking. And 3 governments have come and gone, but this issue has not been addressed. And when I tell my student in the class that who should get the payment, they laugh and say, sir, why not anybody else, only farmer? But this is the kind of thing I'm referring to. This is the kind of political economy of agriculture markets we are dealing with, which needs to be sort of understood clearly before we talk about what to do, how and how to reform, and how much to reform. I will skip some of these things, but move on to the crux of the matter. I also pose this question to people around that, is it this crisis we are talking about or distress we are talking about only in agriculture? It's a part of the larger agribusiness sector. If it is a part of the larger agribusiness sector, which includes from inputs to processing, retailing and marketing of produce, then why only farmers and farm workers are committing suicide or getting indebted? Yeah? So we need to examine this. Therefore I say that there's money in agribusiness, but farmers don't have access to it, do not have a foothold where money can be made from the farm produce as it moves along the value chain. The other issue I have with this understanding of agricultural markets, a lot of agricultural economists look at producer share in consumer's rupee. This methodology has been used for so many decades, but I find that it's now outdated. Because today, even if you look at fresh produce retailing by supermarkets, there is value addition taking place there as well in terms of cleaning, grading, packing, and so on.
Pleasure to meet you, sir. I'm one of your admirers. You require a stick to walk. Yes. Hello. How are you? Good to see you.
No, no, sir. Sure. So if we recognize that there is value addition taking place by different stakeholders within the value chain, then we cannot be asking for very high share for the farmer in the consumer rupee. You can't be talking in terms of 70-80% share of the final consumer product going to the farmer. You have to have more reasonable assessment of farmer benefit in a value chain. And also many times we don't look around to see what are the possible market outlets for farmer produce. I generally throw this challenge out on the audience saying that whenever we talk about market outlets for farmers, theoretically there could be 6 options for the farmer to sell her produce. And I say that even in India, in most of the places, you could have at least 3 channels available to farmers, provided you are market conscious. Only thing is we don't try, the market institutions of working for farmers do not try adequately to explore markets for farmers. I will not go into details of that. I've listed there what are those 6 options which can be thought of. The challenges are in terms of that Indian agriculture is aging in terms of farmers' age. Average age of an Indian farmer is about 50 years now. New people are not interested, youth are moving away, a lot of people are leaving agriculture because it is also about modern skills. If you're today talking about organic or fair trade or ethical trade based farming or global gap certified farming, it is not everybody's cup of tea. You need to understand the market and then do that kind of farming. Also, there is this issue of economies of scale and scope, which I have already developed on, is saying that farm size is not an issue. What we need is the post-production helping out of the farmer in terms of creating platform where farmers can buy together and sell together, both in terms of better bargaining, better quality, better prices and so on. So that's where I think a lot of the crux of the problems of agrarian sector lies. So one can specify the Indian agriculture's constraints in terms of 3 aspects: assets, the resources, the markets, and institutions and policy. I would place the biggest emphasis on institution and policy because you can't do much about assets, you can't do much about markets beyond a point for the individual farmers, but you can have markets manipulated in terms of the collectives dealing with them. I would skip this part on focus on agriculture in terms of doubling of farmering, a very welcome change in terms of moving from producing more to seeing whether farmer is able to get something out of it. Because I personally feel that farmers and farm workers' food security is as important as other segments of the population. And now let's get down to the issues at hand, which is what are the challenges facing agricultural markets in terms of policy and practice. The government of India, for the first time in 2003, tried to give a model APMC Act, the Wholesale Markets Act, whether grain markets or perishable produce market, fruits and vegetable market, dana mandi or sabji mandi, saying that times have changed. We have new demands on agriculture markets, both from processors, exporters, as well as fresh produce retailers. Therefore, let's look at providing farmers more options. That act provided for direct purchase from farmers without going through the APMC mandi, private wholesale markets being allowed to be set up by private stakeholders and entities. I was told yesterday that Maharashtra has already 50 private wholesale markets which are operational. Many other states have given many licenses. Contract farming, which was illegal earlier, was made legal. And all this happened at the same time when agriculture continued to be a state subject. It still continues to be, and that's one of the policy issues in terms of how much role the union government can play if states have to ultimately carry out these amendments at their state act level, which may be 29, 30 different acts of different states. Now, as I said earlier, we have new stakeholders in wholesale markets, whether it's cash and carry players like Metro, or food retail supermarkets like Reliance or Birla's More, or Namdari's, processors, exporters, and another new entity called farmer producer companies, which Bihar, I'm sure, is making a big deal on in terms of organizing very many producer companies, and one of our students from IIM is involved in a big way. Very happy to note that. So once you have these new players, both on the back end and the front end, you need to do something about making these markets deliver to the requirements of these 2 stakeholders. We have other things happening. The Warehouse Receipts Act is there since 2006, but not many, not even 1,000 warehouses are accredited for getting loans against the farm produce for the farmers. You have organic farming and organic product standards. We had APIDA's standard for organic earlier for export. Now we had national program on organic production. We have national standards, but it doesn't recognize natural farming. There are a lot of areas in India which are into natural farming now, which is beyond organic farming. But the Act doesn't emphasize, still doesn't, Food Safety Standards Authority of India does not recognize naturally produced foods and fibers as something which can be sold as per its regulations. Now what is the issue? Issue is that when you don't have markets working efficiently, it compromises the efficiency of both the buyers and sellers in terms of higher wastage, high cost of procurement or high transaction costs of selling or disposing of your produce, quality losses, lack of quality-based pricing, and many other things. And the experience of corporate involvement in this since 2003 has been very varied across states. I will talk about it briefly if I get time about it. And what do we learn from that? The other big thing which is happening around states is that in the name of very high wastage of perishable produce called fruits and vegetables, many states have started delisting fruits and vegetables from APMC Act. I have been arguing against it. I am saying that don't throw the baby with the bathwater. You need to use this as an incentive for the newer players to come into these markets, so waive the market fee for those who would like to go to farmers to procure directly or who would like to undertake contract farming. Don't do it as in a blanket manner which doesn't help anybody. So basically state is losing revenue and those guys are just not going anywhere near the farms. I would not get in the issue of foreign direct investment in retail, whether it can help farmers, how much and how. Now this is the table which tells you that if you modernize this is what the argument of those who say that if you modernize the Indian supply chains or value chains, then consumer will have to pay 8% less and the farmer will get perhaps 12% more. So both the parties benefit. Therefore, there is a win-win for everybody involved. But I have my own views on this. The benefit to consumer is 6% and the other side is I think 8%. Yeah. So that's what is being claimed. So this is being done because it is argued that now farmers are deprived of benefits of quality input supply and remunerated prices because corporates are not able to link up directly with farmers because of APMC Act. And agro-food industry suffer due to non-availability of quality, adequate, timely and cost-effective raw materials. Therefore, we are not even able to export competitively because you don't get the quality materials at reasonable cost at right time and right place. So all this is leading to the arguments for more efficient agribusiness markets and value chains, food safety being paramount, then sustainability of the farmer in terms of economic resource use, in terms of chemical input use, degradation of soil and water resources, and of course, the social component, how do we carry vast majority of India's farmers who are small and or marginal, 85% operators, along with us so that they are not excluded, they are not left behind. So you have this picture I show everywhere saying that when we come to food safety, we don't want to go to the farm to attend to it, but somebody has designed a machine which claims that you can wash fruits, vegetable and meat of all the chemical residues in your kitchen. And it's selling like hotcakes across the country. Now this is the state of affairs in terms of how our markets look. These photos are from Azadpur Mandi, biggest wholesale market for perishables in Asia. This is what happened there. Most of the perishable produce markets are not regulated. Grain markets are much better regulated, but not perishable produce markets. And that leads to a lot of issues in terms of quality and quality-based pricing or costing or whatever. And more importantly, because we are looking at food safety, the issues of hygiene and convenience, because we talk about good agriculture practices on the production front, but when it comes to markets, we don't talk about good agriculture marketing practices. So we need to talk about good agriculture marketing practices at the same time when we're talking about good agriculture production practices. India is one of the few countries today which doesn't have its own India gap or Indie gap. Chile has Chile gap, Thailand has Thai gap, Mexico has Mexico gap on the lines of global gap, but we don't seem to be anywhere there. Now let me come to the policy part of it, how we are trying to regulate and promote. This Model Act 2017 for the first time has changed the very title of the act. It used to be Agriculture Produce and Market Committee Regulation Act. Now it reads as Agriculture Produce and Livestock Markets Facilitation and Promotion Act. So the assumption now is that we don't need to regulate because farmers are capable of dealing with markets. I disagree on that. I think still there's plenty of role for regulation because now you have bigger players coming to deal with farmers directly. And how come when we have deregulated the agricultural markets, I felt very sad about it because how can you say that farmers don't need any regulation agriculture markets? In the absence of regulation, how can they hope to get a good deal in terms of not only prices, but also for the first time when I visited Bihar after this deregulation, I saw farmers being charged 2% commission in vegetable markets on roadside sheds which private had created. Farmers generally are not supposed to pay any tax commission to the Arthia, but here the farmers were being charged commission of 2% when I last time visited here, just to look at what happened after the deregulation and abolition of the act. So commission agents, which I said earlier that because the interlocking of markets, I have very different take on that, but commission agents are retained as a very central figure in this model act as well, that they will do all that, they will collect the payments for the produce and pay to farmers. I somehow feel that if in 2018 we are still talking about farmers not being able to deal with FCI or CCI or any other direct buyer, then we are living in a fool's paradise. So I think the time has come to do away the institution of commission agents. One of the states did it in 85, nobody wants to talk about it. Madhya Pradesh abolished the commission agents in their act in 1985. And now no state is willing to look at this. We have producer companies, we have cooperatives, we have packs, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, they're procuring food grains through packs, through FPOs, through FPCs, and even farmers groups. So if farmers can sell directly, where is the need for a commission agent to come in and do this? And all the interlocking, which I talk about in terms of credit and inputs, is all informal, illegal, it is not provided under any law. So all that business is being carried out. They have a license only to carry out the facilitation of buying and selling of farm produce. But most of the commission agents do this interlocking, and that puts everything into a problem. So the issue, another major issue with the APLM Act 2017 is that it has changed the domain of what APMC can do. It says it would not regulate marketing of notified agriculture produce in its delineated market area, but only in principal and sub-market yards. Incidentally, contract farming has been brought out or taken away from the APLM Act, saying that there is a conflict of interest, that the trader or the commission agent would not like contract farming because that produce would not come to the market. Many states have also exempted that produce from mandi tax, and therefore they would lose their market, they will not get the commission on that. But the Act has conveniently ignored another very major conflict of interest, which is the private wholesale market. In fact, there is a much bigger and direct conflict between the commission agent or the trader in the local APMC and the private APMC operator. That's why in many states licenses were given, but not many mandis could be operational because these guys didn't give them the land in proper place. They imposed mandi fees on them. They imposed many other charges on them. So I say that if there is a conflict of interest issue in regulation, then we should have taken out the private wholesale markets out of the APLM Act, not necessarily contract farming. Because contract farming is still taking place in most of the states at some level. So this is how you need to look at policy. Yeah, then the other thing which it does, for example, it says that the APLM will take measures to prevent sale purchase of produce below MSP. I think we are just messing up with over-regulation here. I don't know, you would have read the Maharashtra example. This has come from some of the farmers' representatives and unions and NGOs saying that farmers don't get MSP. Therefore, every buyer who buys from the farmer should pay at least MSP. And Maharashtra went ahead and carried out an amendment in the Act saying now even private traders would have to pay minimum support price when they buy from farmer. The traders went on strike. They had to withdraw within a week. My take on this is that if the government of India or any state government has promised MSP to farmers, why should you penalize the private trader? What is the fault he has or she has committed that he is being tied and being hanged for this? The state has committed to provide MSP by backing it up with procurement. The private has not committed. So private should not be asked to pay or mandated to pay MSP. I have told this to farmers union, they agreed. They said this was a blunder on their part to raise this issue. They should not have gone into policy making, but it's already gone into policy making. So there are other many things. I would not spend too much time on that. Come to the Contract Farming Act rather, which is here. That Punjab did something in 2013, which was that it didn't amend the APMC Act because of the political economy of Punjab's agriculture markets and various lobby groups playing their own roles. So they said, okay, we want contract farming, but since we can't amend the APMC Act, we would have a separate Contract Farming Act. So the union government has picked up that model and said, now we'll have a separate model Contract Farming Act. Punjab never operationalized it. Even today, it's not operationalized. They created a superstructure which was very, very costly, which was like the Chief Information Commissioner's office. So I argued against this when it was being drafted that no, you don't need to have a separate act on contract farming, but this has been taken through. The rationale being given is that this to avoid conflict of interest, which I talked about earlier, and also 5 to 10% lower transaction cost wire. So everybody will be interested in picking up farmers' produce. It also makes crop insurance part of the contract farming arrangement, which is a good thing. But it does away something very beautiful in the 2000 Act, which was that there were some mandatory and some optional provisions of the Act, which has been now removed. The problem with this, the committee which done is that it goes overboard in facilitating contract farming, as the Act has a provision for the producer even leasing out her agricultural land to the sponsor lessee. Now this is actually overstepping your mandate, because contract farming by definition does not involve cultivating land, even if it's not owned. That is corporate farming. So by stating this, actually the committee has gone ahead and say, okay, even if you do corporate farming in the name of contract farming, that's all right. So this is the kind of issues which one faces when one looks at this. And then it talks of contract farming promotion regulation board, which would not only popularize crops under contract farming, but also promote the markets for these crops in export and domestic markets. How can a regulatory body do this? It's the job of promoting markets and promoting different products is not the job of a regulatory body, but this has been also provided. That shows that there is a shift from regulation to facilitation, and it's going really overboard in promoting that kind of shift in the policy. So my issues with this act are that there is a poor rationale for separate act on contract farming. The Contract Farming Model Act is silent on many important things like delayed payments to farmers, delayed deliveries of perishable produce at the factory or collection center, contract cancellation damages, production risk sharing other than crop insurance, tournaments making farmers compete with each other, which happens in US and is banned there. It is happening in India also, but we have not taken note of that. And more importantly, group contracts. If you have smallholders, I somehow feel that only way to work better with modern players on the buying side is to have group contracts. The act does not even mention group contracts. There is a country next door called Thailand, which contract farming for agriculture development by providing it in their national development plans for 10 years. It is called 4-sector cooperation plan, saying private companies, farmers, agricultural cooperative bank, and the extension department to work together to provide better market interface and facilities of extension and credit to the contract growers. It was written in their plans, and they said that we would only encourage group contracts because farmers are small. But here we just don't seem to be worried about that. So if we look at the experience of contract farming, so far I've done some 3 dozen case studies of contract companies and crops across the country, across states. Farmers' production risk is generally not shared. Prices are still based on open market prices, including for organic produce. You only give 5%, 10%, 20% premium. If we say that our APMC is not good enough in discovering a good price, then how can you use that price, badly discovered price, to give your price to the farmers as contract price or direct purchase price? All the food supermarkets are doing this. When Reliance or Birla procure from farmers, they go by the previous evening's APMC prices and add a few paisa more to that to procure from the farmers next day from their registered contact growers. The contracts have been highly one-sided. Small farmers have not been part of these contracts most of the time, except 1 or 2 crops like gherkins or to some extent maize. The other big thing which is very worrying, which is happening from a larger perspective, is that contract farming is leading to a lot of reverse tenancy. That since small and marginal farmers are not preferred suppliers by those buyers, and they don't have the resources to invest on the farm for global gap and other things and so on, they end up leasing their land to medium and large farmers. So operationally, the land control is shifting to the hands of medium and large farmers, and all the benefits of government programs actually flow to those farmers. The reverse tenancy is actually getting perpetuated with the practice of reverse tenancy and the contract farming. I don't even want to talk about other issues of child labor, gender, and so on, which goes on here. These are pictures from contract farms in Gujarat, in Punjab, and elsewhere. The workers are not even, I somehow say that since Indian agriculture is largely feminized now, the women workers are the sheroes of this sector. They do most of the work on the farm, but when it comes to paying minimum wages, we don't care. No state implements minimum wages. Surprisingly, Gujarat, for the first time, this month don't have lands, but they are the real workers on the farms. Go beyond farmer to small farmer to tenant to worker. Tenants, we have seen the Andhra Pradesh experience. Nothing much happened even after giving those licenses and so on. So this is what the BT cotton front from the way the produce comes to PMC mandis, sabji mandis, entered from APMs, any commission, the buyer will bear all the commission, producer company will not have to bear any charges. And this year's budget, union budget has already given tax exemption, income tax exemption to producer companies if their turnover is below 100 crores. For 5 years, they will not have to pay any tax. So there's a great opportunity for farmer producer company to get going to help farmers. But I would still say, whatever new channels we may have, direct purchase, contract farming, whatever, unless and until we reform the good old or bad old APMC mandi, we are not going to get anywhere so far as the vast majority of India's farmers are concerned. So free licensing for better competition should be of different states, good or bad, but that's the reality of. So the state has to see what role it plays in terms of not only facilitating, but also regulating for the benefit of smallholders. The one thing I would say before I conclude is that we have had enough of production orientation in the farm sector. It's high time for markets. We make farmers more market oriented. We bring more market-based production practices on the farm so that we are not only competitive globally and nationally, but we are also able to give a decent livelihood to farmers and farm workers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Singh, for elaborating.
Sorry, I'm accustomed to standing up. Friends, respected Modi ji, Professor D'Souza, Professor Goendrao, Professor Mukherjee, my colleague, Mr. Siddharth, Mr. Singh, and other distinguished friends. At the outset, I apologize for the delay in coming over. In Japan, they have a system called JIT, that is just in time. They don't even unload or load. But now I said that now in our country, we don't have JIT, we have got sit somehow in time. and IST is generally described as not Indian standard time, but Indian stretchable time. So I think we are in the process of stretching, but I will do my best to confine to the time that I have been allotted, which has not been specified so far. Okay, having said that, I must also say why I chose this subject. The subject is fiscal, monetary, and regulatory policies. Basically, as we know, in the recent past, there has been a lot of debate about the fiscal policy, monetary policy, fiscal authorities, institutions, etc. So but there are some fundamentals, and I thought we should visit. Basically, they're supposed to be independent, fiscal policy independent, monetary policy independent, and regulatory policy is independent. I think they emphasized the independence. The rest of the world emphasized independence. They ended up with a crisis. So we didn't have independence, and we ended up with a low growth. After some time, we started changing that, and then globally also there's some change. But at the moment, I find there is some other type of change. So by and large, there is a bit of a confusion globally about the relative roles, especially the independence and the dependence. I think the confusion is at a different level. Global level is slightly different confusion from Indian level of confusion. So I'm trying to share with you my confusion about these two confusions. See, to go into preliminaries, basically the fiscal policy, just to recall, fiscal policy basically deals with the government's revenue, taxation, expenditure, borrowing, and influence the economic activity. What does monetary policy do? Monetary policy is in charge of basically ensuring the supply of money, the cost of credit, and ensure that there is trust in money and finance. And that's, the third is the regulation. Regulation is basically to see that the market rules are framed properly, the rules of the game are observed, and the idea is that there is a certain amount of independence so that people if the government has the power to spend and power to create money, then there may be loss of trust and political cycles. So there is some logic. And people generally emphasize the logic for independence. But very often in this debate, we miss out the type of interdependence. So first, monetary policy. See, the monetary policy of central banks impacts fiscal position. Because all monetary operations, if you want to do, we are talking of liquidity, we are discussing liquidity. So liquidity is managed very often by the government, by the RBI, through open market operations. The open market operations means buying the government securities and selling the government securities. And when you sell the government securities and buy the government securities, not because you need it, to influence the monetary conditions, you are influencing the rate of interest of the government securities. The government is affected. The government has to borrow. The government is issuing the government securities. So how can the government be totally indifferent to the open market operations of the RBI? It affects. I don't know why, how, and that's all different matter, but it affects. Their operations affect. Then the second thing is that you have the debt government. Secondly, the cost of borrowing by the government at any point of time. When the interest rate is high, if the RBI is keeping the interest rate high, very often we forget. If the interest rate is high, the government borrowing program also costs higher. So there is an impact on the government borrowing. So it is an interested party. It is an interested party. Third, then you have these interventions in the forex market. Whenever you have foreign exchange coming in, excess foreign exchange, you want to handle the exchange rate, then you have to sterilize it. When you sterilize it, there is excess liquidity. Then you have to suck in the liquidity. When you suck in the liquidity, you pay a price. And that price has to be borne by the RBI, indirectly by the government. So then you have fiscal, these are called quasi-fiscal operations of the RBI. So, and finally, central banks have what is known as the lender of last resort function. There's as you know, the lender of last resort because of illiquidity. But the question is when you are operating as a lender of last resort, you are not sure whether it is illiquidity or insolvency. Sometimes you acknowledge the risk. Who bears the risk? The government ultimately bears the risk, though RBI is conducting the operations of lender of last resort. So I think these are the ways in which they impact each other. Similarly, we can say in the fiscal policy. Fiscal policy has implications. If government keeps on borrowing, then you will find that the amount available for the rest of the system is low, and the RBI cannot afford to have a situation, and it also has a possible implications on inflation, which in other words is the value of money. Then the domestic assets of central banks. Central banks' assets in their balance sheet are essentially government securities. And therefore, whatever the price of the government securities, it affects the balance sheet also. So now again, if you go to the regulation of financial sector and monetary policy, see, most of the regulators prescribe what is known as liquid assets. When it is any institution, so whether it is SEBI, they have or insurance authority, provident fund authority, they prescribe some liquid assets or some government securities, some percentage of government securities to be there. That means if the cost, the returns for all these regulated entities and the liquidity which the regulator is prescribing is affected by the operations of the Reserve Bank. So another interesting point is in a full service central bank like RBI, it is a monetary authority and a regulator of banks. In some cases, so it's operating on